Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Ethicsverse, the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. If you care about your company, care about your culture, and care about improving your corner of the world. We got a great show for you today. We're going to be talking about everyone's favorite topic, risk proofing for the future, third-party risk management. We have a great panel discussion ready today. So get those fingers ready to start dropping some great comments in the chat as always. And I don't know if we can top what we did last week, but I would love to try those emojis last week. Last week was so fun. That was one of the best ones ever. There's our studio is still full of confetti. I got to figure out how to get that out of here. But thank you all for all the birthday wishes last week. And let's dive in with a couple of great announcements. As we are going through these announcements, as always, like we like to say, your network is your network. Neither are big enough. So drop your LinkedIn URL in the chat and connect with somebody. You know, a lot of us in ethics and compliance, we feel like an island sometimes. We feel we don't have those connections. We're kind of an army of one in many cases. And, you know, interestingly, we are part of this really collegial, really special community that you got to take advantage of. So it's on you to do that. Connect with somebody today, whatever you're struggling with, whatever challenges you might be facing. I guarantee somebody is on this chat today, on this webinar today that you can reach out to and will share their tips and so forth. Follow us everywhere. Everywhere online. Follow us on LinkedIn. You can follow our company page. You can follow my page. We try to put out great content every single day. The best clips from the Ethicsverse, the best clips from our world famous podcast, the Ethics Experts. And, you know, behavioral science is turning into such a hot topic for all of us. We had such great feedback from our featured book last week. So we are going to be giving away the same thing today. The one and only Christian Hunt's famous book, world famous book, Humanizing Rules. So we're going to be giving away 5 of those because we love you. And the more you can understand behavioral science, the more you're going to be able to activate those human sensors in your organization and start crowdsourcing that risk intelligence at scale. So go ahead and drop your best tips in the chat, especially ones around this kind of a topic. The ecosystem is your way to really leverage your specialties, leverage your strengths with a tool that is next gen, that connects with other things and gets you out of the paperwork and into doing those things that only you can do. You can see all of these awards that we've won. I'm very proud of those. But at the end of the day, it's human to human. We want to be an extension of your team. So if you're thinking about making a change in the next year, I would encourage you to reach out to us because guess what? We don't even like making money around here. We just like helping improve compliance programs. We are giving away a year free. So this helps you totally de-risk your transition. That's really the biggest impediment, this inertia where people want to stick with that status quo. We're so confident in our tool. We're going to go ahead and offer that year free. So if you're interested in just seeing what we have to offer, what everyone's talking about, go ahead and hit that QR code or you know, reach out to us directly. I want to highlight a couple of these other books. The name of the game for 2024 is Sharpening Our Saw, you know, increasing our knowledge. And there's so much great thought leadership out there. You have, you know, Mary Shirley's famous book. We have called Level Up, 65 Hacks. We have Christy Grant Hart's book, Your Year as a Wildly Effective Compliance Officer, Sending the Elevator Back Down, the Empathetic Workplace. There are dozens and dozens of books. Don't forget these great stocking stuffers if you want to plan ahead for next year. These kids' books that Tom Fox just put out. We have dozens and dozens of books on the Ethico library. So if you are interested in, you know, you don't have to get Christian's book if you already got it. You know, you can pick anything from the library. But there's so much great information out there, and we want to be continuing to push that. Little podcast spotlight to work into your rotation. I really want to underscore the Great Women Compliance Podcast. This is kind of the second iteration of it, and they have some really great stuff going on. The recent episode on neurodivergence with the one and only Asha Palmer and Ellen Hunt, you know, they had a whole roundtable. I just love the new direction of it. Check out Tom Fox's podcast, the FCPA Compliance Report. And you can also check out the Gallo Cast if you're just doing dishes. All right, next week we are talking about attention, please, elevating E&C learning to the age in the age of distraction. We're going to have some great hacks on that. I'm trying to go fast here, and I'm going to pass it over to the one and only, the coolest guy in compliance, Matt Kelly. Matt, how's it going? Love those specs on you, bud.
Thank you very much, Nick. You know, in fact, I was going to point out that for my avatar, my hair loss is on the back where nobody can see it, and I can fake it, not up at the front. But good to have you here, and we're happy to have everybody here. We have a great panel to talk about third-party risk management. Let's see. I will try to move this forward. Here we are. All right. So we have Nick with the. Oh yeah, Nick, you have the hair. Nice. Okay.
How do you like that look, huh? All right.
Also with us to talk about third-party risk, guest number one is Neil Falkingham. He is the Chief Compliance Officer at GSK, global pharmaceutical company. Neil, welcome. Thank you for having you here.
Thank you.
Nice cyborg look on your avatar. And also Jenny Chung Savage, who is the Chief Compliance Officer at Pinterest, and in the past has worked at, Jenny, I think it's iMarket and various other business and IT services firms as well, correct? Welcome to you too.
Thanks. Love this avatar, by the way.
And I think I'll have to have somebody else put up the standing slide now that we've gone through the avatars. But we are here, as I said, to talk about third-party risk management. And I wanted to carve that up into a couple of big points that I'd love to explore for the rest of the hour. Like, number one is just the sheer range of third-party risks that companies are facing now, because they are proliferating, not just anti-corruption, but cybersecurity, privacy, supply chain, probably a bunch of others that I am forgetting. But how then, point number two, how does a company try and get its arms around this diversity of risks if you're going to try and, I guess, cobble it all into a 360-degree view of that third party's risk? How do you do that? How do you figure out which risks are most pressing? Do you calculate a comprehensive score? What do you do with that information? And then third, how does the compliance team monitor these third parties on an ongoing basis and sort of get a sense of, here's the third party risk for the whole enterprise, and now I, the compliance officer, go to the rest of you, the enterprise management team, to talk about, here's how our use of third parties does or doesn't bring risk to the enterprise. Here's how we can try and fix it and manage it. All of that fun stuff. And as always, for all of our listeners, if you have your own observations to make, or if you have questions of either of our guests or me and Nick, feel free to pop those into the attendee chat as those comments and questions come to you, and we will try and work all of that feedback in throughout the hour. That's what we're looking to do here. So without any further delay, let me just dive right in. I guess maybe, Neil, I'll put the question to you first, and then Jenny second. Could you each talk about just a bit about what are the third-party risks facing your respective organizations? Are they mostly corruption? Are they corruption, cybersecurity? Are they supply chain? Are they something else? Like, what is the range of risk now in third-party risk that you have to worry about? Neil, what do you say?
Great question. Always a key topic for us to discuss within our own organization, and particularly our Risk and Compliance Council. So GSK, for anyone unfamiliar with us, a multinational pharmaceutical company, over 70,000 people employed around the world, operating companies across that world. So a really diverse spectrum of risk, from research collaborations through to manufacturing, active ingredients being manufactured in China and India, and our sales and marketing practices around the world, which come with a degree of regulation. So if I think about our third-party risk program itself, we have shrunk our risk list down to 17 risk domains. We were at 24 at one point when we first implemented it, which seemed a little overbearing. But essentially, at those 17 risks, ones you just mentioned are very prevalent: anti-bribery and corruption, sanctions risk of increasing priority to us, through to employee health and safety, where we have a significant number of contingent workers in third-party organizations supporting our activities. Cyber, privacy, very prominent at this point in time. If I think back to last year, most of our significant third-party issues related to cyber and data issues. So we have a whole host and range. And if you think of those that are more specific, such as assessing good laboratory practice or good manufacturing practice, those are more unique to the domains that we clearly commercialize our assets through. So quite a complex field, but one that we always try to distill down to what is relevant. And as part of the assessment questionnaire, we trigger those risks depending on the type of engagement, the country of the engagement, and the scale of engagement.
Mm-hmm. And then Jenny, same question to you, because you come from a very different sort of background than Neil, working in pharmaceuticals. So do you have different risks, or are the management challenges kind of sort of the same, even though they are different industries, or what do you worry about?
Yeah, let me answer that by sort of first saying that I am with Pinterest right now, and I've actually been at other social media companies as well. But I think a lot of my comments today are going to be kind of a collection of my entire 20 years in the legal compliance space. So, and just to clarify, I was actually at a company, it was called IHS Market, and it was a very unique company in that it was sort of a fintech, but also a commodities company. So pretty diverse in terms of the verticals. So I'm going to answer that by sort of saying all of the sort of third-party risks that Neil, listed are very much top of mind, I think, for most companies. It just really depends on scale and sort of your own, your own customer base and sort of who your clients are, right? So I tend to have sort of a horizon view of all third-party risks that are being faced by the entire enterprise. Really not just the ones that I may personally own or be responsible for as the chief compliance officer. And part of it is that I used to have also a chief risk officer role as well as a chief privacy officer role. So having those three hats, I think inherently I sort of very much looked at the full range of third-party risk, knowing that there was, that there was a lack of, I would say, cohesion in how the risks were managed and monitored. So part of my sort of chief risk officer role, again, at a company that was not heavily regulated, but I would say partially regulated, it was very, very important to sort of bring together all of the risk subject matter experts into sort of an efficient and streamlined process so that we had a comprehensive view of our risk management opportunities and challenges, right? I think what often makes me the most worried in any kind of company that I'm at, because there's so many different levels of maturity around third-party risk management. I think what worries me most is when we're not looking around the corners and sort of anticipating new and emerging risks that may be associated with third parties, right? So in my opinion, technology and business models are changing pretty rapidly. The geopolitical landscape is, probably more uncertain now than it's ever really been. So I think the strongest response to a lot of these sort of risk, whatever they are, the full range, is to really have a strong and cohesive infrastructure in order to respond and to mitigate against those risks.
Okay. So, Nick, let me swing to you and ask for your thoughts about some of the big common challenges here. And I can already see some of the feedback from the attendees kind of echoing what Jenny just said, where you were talking, Jenny, about a lack of cohesion. Somebody else was saying we can't manage these in silos. That's essentially the same sort of concern. But it sounds to me like trying to get a enterprise-wide consensus of here are all of our issues. That's going to be a really tough thing to do. But Nick, what do you see as some of the big obstacles?
Yeah, I think that's a big one from an internal perspective, right? How do we get these risk experts? How do we get the benefit from all these risk experts to kind of be integrated so that we can have a clear picture of the risk landscape that we're traversing across? I think, one of the big ones externally is, the struggle that I think a lot of folks have in continuously monitoring those third-party risks, like after the initial assessments, and how those assessments sort of need to change in the context of a changing geopolitical landscape, to Jenny's point, and so forth. But so like that lack of visibility and controls in a broad economy, or a broad secular trend where more and more non-core functions are being outsourced to these third parties, where we can't outsource our responsibility, but we are outsourcing kind of the hands doing these different functions that we're relying on them for. It's just increasingly difficult when we don't have that finger on the pulse, or to Jenny's point, when we don't have that like integrated ability to see around the curve.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to pick apart a bit something that for everybody who's listening, in a planning call we had earlier this week, both Jenny and Neil said that one of the big objectives for them is getting other parts of the enterprise to take ownership of the third-party risk. And I guess maybe, Jenny, I'll start with you, ask if you could tell your tale of how did you get people to do that? And then Neil, you've also cracked that same sort of challenge, so I want to hear it from you as well. But let's first talk about how do you get people to take ownership of risk management. Eventually, I want to circle back into how do we then also get them to buy into the central risk management vision. But Jenny, what was your tale about how you can get the rest of the enterprise to take ownership here?
Yeah, I'll try to be succinct here because it was actually a really great project, and I think the end state where we landed was very pragmatic, and it really did solve quite a bit of problems. So I guess I would say I'm a very big infrastructure person, and so what I mean by that is that I think there's lots of third-party risk management frameworks out there. Although ironically, I feel like they are very subject specific, right? So you're going to have like the NIST cybersecurity risk management framework and all of that. I do think that two things. I think a strong infrastructure, which really means having a framework and a governance structure, policies, process, all of that good stuff, really formalized and implemented. Is incredibly important. I can go into some detail around that one. The second thing is ease of use and the user experience, right? So when we talk about like ownership, I think the reality is that the business sponsor, so folks in the business who are the ones, asking to bring on a third party or an outsourcing vendor or whatever, they do need to take ownership. I think that's the one sort of stakeholder that probably needs to have a bit more education about their role. And I use the word business sponsor for a very specific reason, right? They are the sponsor of that third party. And their role does not end by simply triggering a risk review by the different SMEs. Their role continues throughout the entire life cycle, right? And they actually have an obligation at the very end of the day. So I think it's bringing in all of these constituents, but I do think that having a very succinct and sort of user-friendly experience will help the business sponsor, number one, want to engage you, right? Because they can, frankly, I've seen companies where lots of people are off doing their own self-purchasing. They're doing their own onboarding of third-party vendors, and the legal and compliance and procurement team have absolutely no idea what's happening. So you do want to build sort of a framework and an infrastructure where there's a single front door for all of your business sponsors to come and open that front door. And you want to have a process and a risk assessment process that is timely, streamlined, efficient, and so that you know that the experience will be a positive one for that business sponsor, and they'll understand that that wasn't such a terrible experience. I think I will go to legal and compliance.
When you talk about a user-friendly experience, that was what, like an easy checklist or dashboard they could use to say, here's why we want this, and here are the steps that I need to have you do, business owner. Like, what was the user-friendly experience for them?
Yeah, so there, we had a couple of steps. I think technology is always one that can be a double-edged sword, right? Like, ideally, if you have a platform, and there's lots of platforms out there that kind of help you with risk management, assessments and reviews. But if you have a platform and a technology system that allows, sort of a conversation, a back and forth between you and the business sponsor, you and the vendor, the third party that you're onboarding, that it's this comprehensive dashboard and workflow that is going to give everyone visibility, right? Honestly, the best that I've seen is where a business sponsor can actually go in and see where they are in the process. How many other risk SMEs are still outstanding? Where's the vendor in terms of like responding to the different risk questionnaires that are out there? Where am I stuck? Am I stuck at the contracting phase? Like where am I? So I do think that like that kind of visibility and that kind of clarity about everyone's roles and expectations is extremely important. And I think, I mean, I can go into a little bit of detail about sort of the third-party risk management office that me and my team created. It was a very long process with lots of, folks getting, sort of educated and sort of stakeholders being bought in. But once we stood it up and operationalized it, it really solved so many problems.
Okay. Yeah. So, Neil, tell us your story of the same sort of a challenge. You've got a very different sort of structure and risks than Jenny did, but I'm guessing that you still had some of the same sort of infrastructure challenges or process challenges that you'd have to build. How did you try and get the ownership third-party risk question solved at GSK?
Sure, absolutely, Matt. And many of Jenny's comments resonated. Getting that right governance structure being critical. I'd have to flip back 10 years. And if you Google a little bit of GSK history, we had a compelling matter that we had to address with our China business and with the SEC. And that provided a great deal of impetus to the organization to structurally understand our third-party risk profile, because we were not in the right place at that point in time. I took, at that point in time, a leader who had developed shared service programs and worked in our shared services environment along with a tech leader to devise the right program with all the right relevant risk inputs, but essentially taking someone who wasn't a compliance expert, but understood how you got teams to work together and systems to work together and data flows to work. And that was at the heart of an evolved program that we have got to today. And if I give you the end state, today, the procurement organization own the third-party risk process, the platform, and the execution throughout our organization. I provide the risk adjudication at the top of the house for the program. But the heart of it is business ownership. And it's a very easy phrase to say, and it's not an easy phrase to get. We started with that 10 years ago. So if you own the activity, if you spend the money, you own the risk. We will help you understand the risk. We will give you direction in terms of what are the corrective actions that you might need to address or you will need to address. And the explicit responsibility that you have as a business owner to be able to engage the third party and to understand the risk that they're creating, and to escalate the issues to your risk board or to management when you need additional support. But that journey to business ownership, if you were Mexico in 2014, they have still got scars as to the implementation of our risk program then. To now, where we have a managed service provider, a ServiceNow front end, and you're able to engage in under 20 questions and begin a risk assessment and to gain the relevant risks that are appropriate for wherever you are and whatever. So we continue to lead with the business has to be accountable. We have got better in our systems and processes and making it easier for people to manage risk and to conduct the activities that they want to or the relationships they have. Okay. We still come unstuck when we talk about global businesses, where you're always searching for the person who's going to manage Amex or one of the larger global enterprises. But certainly at a country level, that concept now of business ownership and the accountability and the direction we give them, they have visibility, I think, as Jenny just described it, throughout the process. So where is the risk assessment? Where are the SMEs? What are they reporting on? What are they characterizing the risk score throughout the whole of the assessment? And then we have a life cycle for renewal as well. So it's all transparent. The data set is there. We have independent monitoring of that risk process, as well as the accountability well defined for the business owner and explicitly what actions we expect them to take when. But it's a constant reinforcement. We turn over employees on a daily basis, so you've got to keep it alive for everybody.
Nick, I don't know if you have any thoughts here, but what really strikes me is that both Jenny and Neil have basically talked about the need to make this a user-friendly, inviting process, so the rest of the business isn't scared of compliance and isn't trying to avoid them. But I mean, we hear that so often in so many of these Ethicsverse sessions that the compliance team, to a certain extent, has to meet the rest of the people where they are, or else they're just not going to want to play with you. What do you think about what we've just been covering here?
Well, I think what they both said is spot on, and it echoes what you just mentioned, that if we can't do any of these jobs on our own. We need the participation of the workforce. We need the participation of those business leaders or those owners of those relationships to, do their own due diligence and, remain accountable for the risks that they are, opening the organization up to. I think this focus on the user and focus on the person or the human sensor, as we call them, that needs to participate in this risk management process is a smart one, because at the end of the day, their participation is going to determine whether whether someone is falling asleep on the guard tower or not. You know what I mean? We can't be in all those spots. I'd love to hear, though, from the panel, how do you, is it sticks or carrots? Is it, we're talking a lot about accountability, but how do we drive that engagement? Is it a silk glove, or is it the iron fist inside of a silk glove? Like, how do we incentivize the behaviors? Have you been able to tie some data points down to, performance measures that can be attributed to those individuals or to those business units as sort of a way to reinforce their participation?
Jenny first, and then Neil. What would you say to Nick's point?
First of all, I love what was it? An iron hand and a silk glove.
Yes.
I think it's really about where your company culture is at, to be honest with you. I think a strong company culture where you can really rely on shared values and sort of a shared objective will go a long way, right? I mean, at the same time, pragmatically, look, I think the reality is there's a place for consequence management, right? And so the issue becomes like, if you develop this great governance model and this great infrastructure with clear policies, roles and responsibilities, the whole life cycle, right? And you find that, an X percentage of your business is just refusing to engage with that process that you've built so beautifully. What do you do with that, right? How do you implement some consequence, or how do you enforce that? I will say it's a long process. I mean, I think when I first did this, we rolled out a pilot, right? So rather than rolling out to the entire enterprise, we sort of did a pilot. We kind of took a business unit. We had a bunch of verticals. We took a business unit, sort of did a pilot with them, sort of tweaked it and all of that. At the end of the day, it really required so many road shows, so many road shows, so much like office hours, education. Really, honestly, our executive team was huge, right? Because if you don't get them to sort of, number one, understand what you're implementing and the value that it's adding, and then speaking about it, that sort of tone at the top, you're only going to get so far. But I actually felt like, for me personally, getting buy-in and user engagement, right, with the middle managers, that was critical. Those are the doers.
Right. So
yeah, that's sort of my answer to whether it's a stick or carrot.
Neil, what's your take on this?
So very familiar, with that phrase, because that's how my wife is described, the iron fist in the velvet glove. But it is very much that approach of culture. I think it's so important. We have one of our principles, which is we have three pillars, but one of them is being accountable for your impact, and another one is doing the right thing. It sets the tone for the organization. On the fist side of things, we have some hard controls. If there is not an active risk assessment in place, you will not be able to engage with that third party. You and contract. At the same time, for the silk, we've also created what we call a green channel. So in other words, where we've seen a low risk threshold, and we've enabled people to be able to activate their third party activity very simply and very quickly, without some of the additional burden of the risk assessment, because we'll run that behind the scenes. But at the heart of it is, again, just coming back to where, are we showing the right accountability across the organization? So every single risk management board in every company in the GSK universe will discuss third-party risk. Every enterprise risk or principal risk, we're a UK company, so we talk about principal risks. And those principal risks could be patient safety. Well, within patient safety, we will still have a section on what is the third-party risk exposure associated to this risk domain, so that we're constantly bringing it to the fore and recognizing that we can't operate, we cannot deliver as a company without third parties and partners around the world, and they're so critical. So again, the noise, the publication, the roadshows, the information is a constant flow, and you have to bring that constant reminder to your organization.
I did want to ask another sort of nuts and bolts question about when the business unit does show up at the portal or the user-friendly site. They say, we want this sort of engagement. And then it does have to go through this subject matter expert review. Like, how does that part work? Because A, you have to do it, but at the same time, B, if it takes too long, the business unit owner might then try to say, well, I'm just going to evade all of this. So I am curious, when we have so many different risks and experts need to look at it from so many different ways, how do we do that efficiently and at scale so the rest of the business will say, I'm still willing to go through this process? Jenny, let me ask you, and then Neil, how does that work for each of your organizations?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the attendees here were talking about silos, and and honestly, it is, I have a lot of empathy, right? I mean, even I'm a business sponsor and user, right? I have to onboard my own compliance vendors and third parties. So I do see how frustrating it is when you don't sort of have a cohesive structure and process in place to go from subject matter expert to subject matter expert, whatever your domain risk assessment, review is, without like a clear, without clear guidance, right? And so what we ended up doing, and this took some time, because ownership and accountability is a question that I think everyone either loves or hates, right? And especially when you have a very cross-functional process like third-party risk management, you have all of your risk SMEs, and everyone's sort of working in their domains and their swim lanes. But I think what was missing for us was sort of a horizontal, overarching, what I would call a quarterback, right? It's sort of like a cybersecurity incident. You would love to have a commander quarterbacking something. So we ended up creating this office that was quarterbacking. They weren't necessarily the risk SMEs, but they were quarterbacking the whole process. And I don't want to use this phrase, but it's a little bit of a white glove service to the business sponsor, in the sense that, like, especially for those businesses that were onboarding kind of critical but high risk vendors, right? Like you pass the inherent risk assessment and perhaps they come up and they're like critical but fairly high risk.
Yeah.
So you want to make sure that you give them a little bit of a white glove service, in the sense that the third party risk management office would sort of make sure, because it was a critical vendor, perhaps impacting a huge percentage of your company revenue, that you kind of move them through the process as efficiently and as quickly as possible, but still doing your due diligence, right? So I don't know if I answered your question about, like, what do you do when when you don't have a business sponsor using that, but yeah.
Well, we can explore that, but first, Neil, what's your analysis or your description of the same sort of function? Like, how do you make this SME risk process go smoothly and briskly, but also efficiently? And you've got, thousands and thousands of third parties. You have to do this at scale. Like, how does it work?
So an established process and a robust process to avoid people going for workarounds, I think is sort of at the core of this. Just picking up on Jenny, a third-party risk office, we used to have that in our compliance organization. We transitioned that over to our procurement team a couple of years back. But essentially that group providing that independent monitoring across all of our risk assessments. So in other words, looking for those outliers, looking for those inconsistencies in our data set where potentially people have tried to do a workaround. This engagement type is X, not Y. X is high risk, Y is not, and looking for the inconsistencies that we see, and then calling those out to the business. If just going back to that very specific example you said about, someone saying, I really have to work with this company. We have a no-fly list. So we have a prohibited parties list, and it does not matter what you come and protest to me about. If it's on a prohibited parties list, we will not work with them. The next ground is an escalation process. And the escalation process we have is you have to go to your corporate exec team member. And when you tell someone they have to go to the C-suite, essentially to have an approval, if they want to negate the red flags and continue to work with that, it's amazing how many of those decisions change. And it often influences the motive. So maybe that's a little bit more of the fist than the glove. But again, I think you have to have credible questioning and credible deterrence in there as well to get people to continue to work with the core process. If you stick to that process, then we know we've got a robust risk assessment in place. We know we've got a robust process for managing a third party through the life cycle, and trying to ensure that we still continue to do the right thing.
Okay. Nick, what do you think about all of this here? And the idea that, compliance needs to, I guess, like I said before, strike that right tone. I loved your carrots and sticks analogy earlier that, you do want to meet the business where they are, but on the other hand, you kind of sort of have to you have to have the stake in your back pocket for incidents like, we really want this third party. No, you can't have it, period. And the role that compliance officers need to play here.
Well, I think Neil said something smart. He said a lot of smart things, but when you have I guess what both answers we heard is really just an application of a risk-based approach to managing these risks, right? We have these no-fly lists that if you want the approval, then you have to kind of take some ownership and go and kind of get that, get that C-suite kind of get them to override it. That puts a lot of the onus and a lot of the ownership on that person who's advocating for that third party, and I think that's extremely smart. But again, this risk-based approach and that focus on the ease with which these participants can engage with these third parties while also balancing the risk is critical. Neil said we need to have a robust process and procedure in place, and I just kind of kept thinking back to establishing a kind of an anti-fragile framework that allows for this kind of changing landscape for the framework to adapt to that changing landscape. I'd also love to hear there's something great in the chat here about let me just read this question. I'd love to hear everybody weigh in on it. You too, Matt, because you've kind of starting to become a bit of an expert on this with some of the stuff you've been writing. Lately, we're seeing that many of our partners and vendors are starting to use AI, and we're challenged to really complete the full due diligence of those partners and vendors to screen them, as we are not truly equipped and don't have full knowledge of them. What would be your advice in dealing with this upsurge? How have you guys started to think about this kind of emerging risk in the context of these, these procedures and these, processes that you've built?
That's an excellent question I was going to put to them, and so let's just go for it. Neil or Jenny, I don't know which of you might want to take the lead on this, but I think it is something that if you now have a third party that is embracing the technology that at best humans kind of sort of have a sense of maybe how it works, but not really. Like if they're using that, how are you supposed to try and get an assessment of the third party's risks when they're operating in that way? I don't know. What would you say?
Neil, I'll start. Is that okay?
Yes, go for it.
I can start.
You probably have more interest.
Actually, and I think it's going to hit every industry. But the reality is, so it's interesting. I think this kind of dovetails with, I think, what's happening right now in the legal compliance space, which is we are, I think many of us are challenged to put together some AI governance and compliance policies and models, right? Like what is our own appetite around the use of AI, both internally and then through our partners and vendors as well. I would say that I think, the due diligence piece is one thing. I would lean extremely to the extent that you have a partner or a vendor that is starting to use AI, and maybe it's an incumbent partner or vendor, or maybe it's one that you're onboarding. But I think your commercial legal team is a huge partner here, because I really rely on them to come up and, as they're papering up the engagement with their contract agreement, I mean, they're the ones that are really allocating the risks that are involved, right, through their various provisions within the agreement. So I think that they're a huge partner in sort of understanding and maybe allocating the risk and also mitigating it. I will say that I think a lot of it's a huge conversation around, it's in combination with legal and compliance. to the extent that you have an enterprise risk management office or enterprise risk management function. It's this conversation around what is the risk appetite that you have around how you and the company want to engage with AI, right? And there's going to be probably a policy, Neil, I'm sure you're probably pulling together an AI policy right now around that issue.
Neil, what is your take? You can't get away from this AI question.
Absolutely not. And we have embraced it fully across the organization. A lot of our research is truly empowered by AI. And in fact, we even have our own AI ethicist sat within our R&D organization. So we have a governance board established to review specific use cases for AI. Within our risk assessment, we also have a number of questions to highlight whether AI is being used by a third party and in what context. One of the starting points is, can they actually explain it coherently? Actually, if you can't get a coherent explanation of what are you using it for, then we can't assess it internally. But that's a starting point. Again, just come back to the obvious question. Then we have a number of resident experts, as Jenny said, in our legal organization, as well as in our tech organization, who can opine on the relevance, the use, and also what data, what is being ingested. And that's always a critical piece. I'm always looking for the explanation, not just the shininess of the item.
Yeah. And Nick, since you asked, I'll just give my quick take on this. I think that people should always remember that as profound as AI is, to a certain extent, it's just another new technology. And 45 years ago, our parents and grandparents were all worried about how to integrate spreadsheets. And today, if we ask, well, who owns spreadsheets, the question would make no sense. I'm presuming our children will have the same response to AI sometime in the future. But it's more about, do you, third party, have an intelligent approach to how you are governing the use of this new technology? And do you need to understand all of the black box parameters of the AI algorithm? No, I don't think any of us can. But should you make sure that this third party knows how to groom the right data to feed into the algorithm? And do they know enough to check the outputs to make sure that they still make sense? And the one good example I'll give that comes to my mind is there was a facial recognition technology that a big pharma chain, they just got busted for this last month by the Federal Trade Commission, where they were using facial recognition to spot potential shoplifters. What about the opportunity, the chance of a false positive where the AI flags a shoplifter, but the AI is wrong? And the pharmacy company said, we really didn't think about that. Like, why not? That's not far-fetched. But would you ever not test a technology to make sure it works? And those are the sort of things that, those are going to be true regardless of if it is AI and the big, sexy new ChatGPT fears we have, or spreadsheets from 1980 when they were first introduced. Like, it's all about what's before and after the AI, not the thing in the middle that we're not going to understand.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. Thanks for that. Great answers, you guys. Those were phenomenal. I agree with all those. Those were great.
I did want to ask another nuts and bolts question. I had gone into this thinking that with so many different third-party risks, the objective is to analyze them all and I guess boil it down to a score for the third party. And if it's above this score, we don't use them. If it's below, we do. Is that a correct perception of how it works? But B, the other thing I was wondering was just the sheer volume of third-party data you collect. How do you manage it when it's coming from different third parties? It's substantively different stuff. It might be in different formats. But I had thought that this all goes into a funnel. It all gets whipped up together and it spits out some sort of a score, and then you know what to do. I'm listening to Jenny and Neil now. I'm assuming it's more complicated than what I just sketched out. But what is it? Like, what's the data collection and analysis, and what's the final result that you get? Neil, I'll start with you, and then Jenny. Like, how does that actually work?
Multiple scores is probably the one answer to that question, because you're looking at every single risk being rated and assessed and the actions therefrom. So at the heart of this is really good workflow management. It's good data warehousing. It's appropriate policies for retention and also for assessment of information that comes in. Do we have a single risk score upon which the threshold, and you'll say we don't work with them? No, we haven't. We don't go there. What we do is then characterize, critical, high, medium, and low based on each risk domain, and some risks matter more than others. Let's be clear. There is a lot of regulatory scrutiny that we have on cyber, on anti-bribery and corruption, on sanctions, and therefore we are in the background of that looking at a risk rating on where any activity is occurring and the relative cash value to give us an overall perspective, so that I could say we have 5,000 high-risk suppliers for the company, and then looking at those on a country-by-country basis and looking at the types of those suppliers, and then running additional deep dives, or we would call it a management confirmation, be that on a healthcare organizations across the globe or distributors. And we will run that assessment annually to really drill down on a specific type. But we don't, at this point in time, have an individual risk score for every single third party that we work with. Do I want one? Yes, because I kind of like data. Do I think that I know what I'm going to do with it when I get it, unless it's truly dynamic and informed on a second by second, day by day basis, right, and I can create a decent risk indicator around it with some thresholds and actions? I'm not there. I'd love to maybe be there, but I'm a little bit nervous of how to get there.
Okay. And Jenny,
how do you arrive at some number that can account for the diversity of risks across these thousands of different people? I mean, it's virtually kind of impossible. We're not like rating bonds. Those are pretty easy to rate, right? Like you can come down to a single number. It's almost like trying to come up with like an ESG rating for an organization. Like there's so many different organizations and there's so many different things in the E and the S and the G, it kind of comes down to human judgment. I imagine we have to flag those risks and then apply some kind of a risk-based judgment framework on, can we take this risk on? Is this risk, idiosyncratic to the company? Is it, really based on the country that it's in and so forth? So I think that would be awesome though, right? To just have a heat map and just say, this guy's a 7, let's bring him on board. That'd be great.
Yeah, and I do that for other areas. I have country risk maps based on their activity base, their assurance levels and things of that nature. But they're only they're one tool. And I think there's a sophistication to third-party risk management that if you were at a single-digit number, I think you lose some of the granularity of the risk and the expression, and come back to where we were earlier in the conversation about business ownership. I still want business owners to understand their actions and what they're accountable for. And if I take too much away, I will lose that important proximity and ownership. Sorry.
Okay. Jenny, what's your take on all of this?
No, I agree with, I would love a single risk score too. I don't think it's absolutely necessary. I think it's actually quite impossible to come to it. I mean, quite frankly, even within the world of sort of enterprise risk management, right? You've got a risk likelihood and risk impact, and so much of that, right, when you're internally analyzing your own risk, is about judgment and context. I do think that the one important thing is to have a common taxonomy. And what I mean by that is, like, the reality is you're dealing with a bunch of different domain risk experts, right? And I have seen far too many times everyone's sort of risk scoring is dramatically different. So if you don't have a common taxonomy, you're really not going to be, kind of speaking to the same thing. You can't arrive at that single risk score, even though you may want it. Same thing with, in terms of judgment, it's also context. Like, I try to be as sort of business friendly and pragmatic as possible, kind of weighing the risks and knowing that there might be a business, again, the context is the particular vendor, that vendor may be sitting in some space where their value and their impact is going to be extremely high. They may be critical in many ways because there's no other like second choice vendor. So you have to kind of put all of that into the analysis to come up with either a, yes, we can accept this risk, or no, we're really not going to accept this risk and move on. And this just goes back to the framework that Neil and I have been talking about in terms of like, you really have to have a clear again, a clear taxonomy, a clear definition of like, who do you consider to be critical, who's your critical vendor, and then sort of the definitions of high, medium, low risk, right? And then your risk acceptance model,
Sure.
which is going to be based on your risk appetite.
Another question that pops into my mind that I've heard other people say before is like, how do you try to simplify the intake of data from the third parties? As in, not only are you requesting data about third party X, but so is everybody else who works with third party X. And they do have a day job running a business, not filling out due diligence forms. And so, I've heard people before say, we want to make sure that our third party risk management effort is easy for the third party too, so that they will want to do business with us. And I don't know if either of you think much about that, or if how you do try to address that, but is that a concern at all about how you make life a little bit more bearable for the third parties as well?
Yeah, 100%. I was going to say, we've been talking a lot about the business sponsor and the user experience. Same thing. You will find that like one of the first things I recognized quickly was everyone had their risk assessment questionnaires. There was just an insane amount of duplication and overlap, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And so your vendor, your third party, was getting 5 questionnaires, all asking roughly the same thing, except for maybe a subsection that was very domain specific. So one, you want to rationalize again, think about like your vendor is filling out these questionnaires. Well, we're also receiving it and we're analyzing it. So you do want to you do want to rationalize all of the questionnaires out there. Again, you want to have that single process, single front door, ideally a single questionnaire that is sort of risk ranked. So I think we've talked a little bit about like, you could easily have sort of a threshold questionnaire just to get a general sense of like, what exactly is that third party bringing to the table? Does that third party need to be physically in our offices? Does the third party need to have, full credentials to get onto our network? Is the third party actually representing themselves as, frankly, a member of your company, perhaps in sales? That there's a whole nother kind of category of like how to risk rank your vendors. And you want to have the questionnaires match that sort of profile.
Mm-hmm. And Neil, how do you try and handle it?
Pretty much as Jenny has just described. So one of the things we've been fortunate over the last 10 years is to start analyzing the information we receive and saying, have we actually done anything with it? And as a result, redacting the number of questions that we actually have to ask, or information that we can pull from, a desktop due diligence supplier that we don't need to ask a third party, or we can provide to them and say, please validate the information we are providing to you. And again, that's all about having the right service in place to support our business activities.
Okay. We have time, about 5 minutes left here. I wanted to ask one last question. And Nick, maybe I'll start with you. What sort of information should compliance be reporting to the board and senior management about third-party risk? And, how much do we want it to be a conversation compliance has about here's how our use of third parties is or isn't wise? But Nick, give me your thoughts, and then Jenny and Neil too. Like, what would you actually want to report to the highest levels about what your third-party risks for the company are and how things are going?
So I like a slide that just has like a thumbs up or thumbs down emoji. I think that kind of cuts to the chase. I'm just kidding, of course. We've started doing these ROI coaching sessions with folks, and I've seen a lot of patterns over the dozen or so we've done over the last few months. About how that 5-minute session or how that 15-minute session that gets compressed down to 5 minutes right before you're walking in the door tend to go. And I think people kind of fall on two ends of the spectrum. And so on one end of the spectrum, there's a lot of like justification energy, or sort of a posture of like, look at all this stuff that I'm doing and look at all the regulations that we're, checking, and, look at all the work I've done. And then other folks on the other side of the spectrum are really kind of assuming a little bit more confidence and a little bit more strength, and kind of trying to stay a little bit higher level, and assuming that the board understands that they're in the position that they're in for a reason, and that they've earned that position of oversight, and they have unique skills that the organization is counting on them. So they're not wasting sort of energy talking about all the things they're doing. They're really talking more about higher level. These are the things that like we have to actually worry about, but more importantly, these are the things I need from you. I really need you to, reinforce this tone at the top, or I really need a message from the CEO that these third-party risks are increasingly important, and the ownership needs to be down at that individual level. So, I mean, look, obviously, if there's burning fire risks of critical third parties that are, mission critical for the organization, those need to be brought to the board. But I just try to draw that distinction between these different ends of the spectrum because, one, I think, on the one hand, you might frame yourself out as kind of the stereotypical, office of no or, anti-business function, or you can frame yourself as this sort of compliance executive and really focus the board on the things that actually matter most to them. They don't need to see all of that stuff. They don't need to see how the sausage is made. They are, as much as there's someone to report to, they're also a tool for us to, get the rest of the organization mobilized to give the risk intelligence and give the sort of human sensor participation we need to do our job effectively.
Okay. And I guess Jenny and then Neil, and probably about a minute for each of you with the time we have left. Like, what is your take on what you want to report to the board or the C-suite about third-party risks?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll be really quick about this. I mean, I think your kind of board level risk reporting is going to be only as good and as useful as your underlying data and process, right? And so what worries me is that I think third-party risk is, clearly, I think across the board, probably one of the top 5 risks that a company, should be monitoring and overseeing. And how you sort of summarize and sort of like cascade that information up at the right level. It really depends on your maturity at the ground level. I do think that the board is going to be, they're going to ask things like, do you even have a handle? Do you have a handle on your entire, sort of third-party profile? Like, I will candidly say that, like, I've asked questions of like, how many vendors do we have? And I will get a response from procurement where they can't give me a number. Right. They can't give me a number. They can't tell me how many are active, how many are, no longer active. It's a challenge. So I think the board should absolutely be asking the question, and I think we need to be prepared to give them not the details, but to give them with some foundation a good sense of our risk profile around third parties.
All right. And Neil, what's your answer to this question?
So three pillars for my compliance program: predict, protect, and enable. And I report on those. So predicting, where do I see emerging risk with our third parties? Protect, is our process and system robust? Do we understand where our high risk third parties are? And enable, are we engaging and supporting the business so that they can actually enlist and actively engage with the right third parties to achieve our business goals? And right. That's how I'm reporting.
All right.
It's such a smart framework.
It absolutely is. That is great, nice and succinct. All right. Well, we are pretty much at the end of the hour then. So I think we'll just have to wrap up here. But Neil Falkingham from GSK and Jenny Chung-Savage from Pinterest, this has been a fantastic conversation. You both gave us tons to think about. And I know that we've got a lot of people in the attendee chat who've been sounding off for the whole hour with a lot more. So,
and you guys earned 1,400 emojis. I mean, look at that brilliance from this panel. This is phenomenal. This is awesome. Thank you guys so much. Thanks for coming to the Ethicsverse. Matt, welcome back, man. It's been a while. So glad you're back. And we hope to see everybody next week. Take it easy.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks all.